Hi there everyone. Today I wanted to go belatedly over the traditions that surround Shrovetide and Lent. I was hoping to get this video up sooner, but unfortunately I've been waylaid, so I do apologise for that. Anyway, I think examining these old customs is important, not only because it gives us an opportunity on a very practical level to reconnect with our ancestors, but also it gives us an insight into how their outlook upon the world, which to a certain extent was much more sophisticated than our modern one, in my opinion. I think it's this loss of perspective that is the root of all our problems. So let's begin. Now, Shrovetide, or some variant of it, is celebrated in some shape or form in all Western countries. In Britain, it is known as Shrove Tuesday. It's also known as Fat Tuesday or Mardi Gras, which is basically the French for Fat Tuesday. Now, Lent is the period of 40 days before Easter, which has always been a period of fasting and reflection. Lent is an Old English word derived from the Germanic, which is associated with the spring period. It is thought to roughly mean lengthen, as the days begin to grow longer. The day before Lent begins the day before Lent begins has always been a day of celebration, a time of feasting and revelry before the sombre mood of Lent begins. Indeed, the word shrove is the past tense of the word shrive. This is an Old English word that comes to us via the Germanic and basically means to impose a penance or to confess. This is due to it being the last day before Lent, so it was common on this day to go to church for confession, although the tradition of Shrove Tuesday is much older than that, as we shall see. Now, during Lent, it has always been common to fast. Indeed, the traditional Mardi Gras carnivals of the Southern European tradition are in the word carnival. They're inspired by this tradition, as the word means literally without meat. So this day was basically one last feast, usually involving foods to be abstained from during Lent, such as meat, butter, eggs and fats, and it's one of the reasons why pancakes were traditionally cooked. And it was also traditional as well for all the food that had been accumulated over the winter and used over Christmas or Yule to be eaten up before this time. Now, I don't want to go too much into the pancake tradition today, but I'd rather concentrate on the more carnival aspect of Shrove Tuesday. This kind of custom, this traditional carnival one, was not common in Britain, but we had our own variant in the traditional football games of this time, which are still played in some places today. Now, they developed into more kind of medieval crowd football games, but they're based on older ball games which are akin to the hurling games played in some Celtic countries. This tradition of some kind of team game is also part of some of the carnival festivities in Italy, for instance, where I can't remember what town it is, I'm afraid, but there's one town in Italy where they divide into two teams and they have to throw oranges at each other. Again, something round and a ball. So it's there's this common thread underlying all of these things, I think. Now, I don't know what these ball games are supposed to represent, but I think it's an idea that warrants further investigation. Now, Catherine Mortwood, who was the researcher and author of the book The Glastonbury Zodiac, which came out in I think it was the 1930s or 40s. In this book, she quotes from an article from a magazine called The Listener. I'm assuming that magazine is now defunct, but you never know. But this article asserts that these ball games are based on an old tradition where one team represents the sky world and one represents the underworld, or that the carnival would be some kind of parade that represented the ancient deities in some way, the old gods. Now, I find this very interesting because I think this indicates where the traditions of things like the carnival and which we don't have in say Northern Europe or Britain, but one of the things that we do have are the mummers plays, and I wonder if that's where they come from. because in later years these deities were replaced usually by kings and queens or people from legends, such as the ruling monarch of the time, King Arthur or St George in England. So I'm wondering if this is how the tradition has sort of been corrupted, basically. And I think this is a very intriguing indication of what this period is really about before it became overladen with Christian meaning, and why the carnival type traditions, the football games, are played at this time of year. I don't know, in all honesty, but they do seem to have some kind of ritualistic type elements. For example, the games usually have 2 or 4 teams, and one thing that did survive is that the 4 teams would sometimes these carnivals or parades would come through the local church, and they would come in through all the directions of the church, the 4 cardinal directions, which is, I suspect, something that came from an older pre-Christian tradition. Now, I also wonder if there's a connection with astrology at this time of year as well, because this time of year, Lent, is roughly represented by the sign Pisces, which is well known for symbolising penitence, forgiveness and compassion, but it also represents completion, glamour and deception, which seems to fit well with the carnival and mummers plays, as well as endings. Now, could it be that the carnival and football games were originally some sort of ritualistic enactment of something to do with the gods, which would maybe indicate possibilities in the year to come? I really don't know one way or another. This is all my speculation in this video. But it certainly would explain, I believe, why sports such as football and rugby, for instance, have such a hold over Western culture in particular, and why the stop watching ball sports guys sentiment is quite naive. I do have sympathy for the sentiment, as I agree that the modern game is just a bread and circuses distraction for the most part. However, as I stated in my Hollywood series, modern culture operates by taking aspects of our culture with very old roots and co-opting them to use against us. They know that we cannot help but resonate with the old ways, but to keep us under control, they give us bastardised versions of our old culture instead, so that it operates in a similar way to a limited hangout, if you like, in that we will not progress any further. Now, the day after Shrove Tuesday is Ash Wednesday. Just recently I came across this very interesting post on Facebook by the Brehon Law Academy, which talks about the origins of Ash Wednesday. So I'm going to read out what was written there. Ash Wednesday is not mentioned in the Bible. None of the apostles observed it. Nowhere are Christians commanded to keep it. It was not even officially practiced until nearly 1,000 years after Christ's resurrection. Like so many other non-biblical Christian customs, it has pagan roots. It's a sad fact that modern Christianity has appropriated so many customs from the practices of heathens that one might wonder if it should still be called Christianity. And that's the introduction, and here's the main essay. So this is about the early pagan origins of Ash Wednesday. This ritual imposition of the ashes is purportedly in imitation of the repentant act of covering oneself in dust and ashes. The marking of believers on Ash Wednesday is done in combination with another extra biblical routine called Lent. Despite Christ's command to his followers to abstain from the practice of disfiguring their faces during fasting, it has become a regular practice. He also told us to wash our faces during a fast. The practice of putting ashes on one's forehead has been known from ancient times. In the Nordic pagan religion, placing ashes above one's brow was believed to ensure the protection of the Norse god Odin. This practice spread to Europe during the Vikings' conquests. This laying on of ashes was done on Wednesday, the day named for Odin, Odin's Day. Interestingly enough, according to Wikipedia, one of Odin's names is Yug, or Yuk. I'm not sure how you pronounce that, to be honest. But it's the same for the Norse word for the world ash, which is called Yggdrasil. So I'm presuming it's pronounced Y. And this name closely resembles the Vedic name Agni. I'm not sure how you pronounce that either, which is Vedic in pronunciation. The Norse practice, which has become known as Ash Wednesday, was itself drawn from the Vedic Indian religion. Now, I'm not sure if it was, but I'll discuss that later. Ashes were believed to be the seed Agni, the Indian fire god. It is from this name that the Latins use for fire, ignis. It is from this root word that the English language got the words ignite, ignis, and ignition. Agni was said to have the authority to forgive sins. Ashes were also believed to be symbolic for the purifying blood of the Vedic god Shiva, which it is said had the power to cleanse sins. Ash Wednesday was taken from Roman paganism, which took it from Vedic India. Ashes were called the seed of the fire god Agni with the... Oh, hang on, sorry, I've read that bit. So yes, sorry. During Rome's New Year Feast of Atonement in March, people wore sackcloth and bathed in ashes to atone for their sins. As the dying god of March, Mars took his worshippers' sins with him into death. The carnival fell on Dies Martis, the day of Mars. In English, this was Tuesday because Mars was identified with the Saxon god Tur. In French, the carnival day was Mardi Gras, Fat Tuesday, the day of merrymaking before Ash Wednesday. Ashes are the residue of fire, and just as fire is regarded in mythology and folklore as something which purifies and also regenerates, or brings new life, so the same properties are associated within ashes. Now, on the whole, I think this is pretty much spot on. However, I am cautious about the assertion that such customs were derived from India. Now, I can't say for sure that they weren't, and I haven't seen any evidence to prove that they were, but I do think it's worth keeping in mind that a great many of our customs will have originated from the same Indo-European route, rather than being copied from elsewhere, and I think that this point gets overlooked a lot more than it should. Now, I'm also wondering if the role of Pisces can be felt here. Although Mars is the god of March, he's also the god of Aries, which begins at the end of March on the spring equinox. Now, it's difficult to tell for sure as the Romans followed a different calendar to us. They followed the Julian calendar and we followed the Gregorian. So many of these festivals and their meanings have become a bit enmeshed with each other and mixed up. I strongly believe that many of these festivals have lots of different layers of meaning attached to them. They're a bit like soil in that regard, with the different eras of history adding and also covering layers of meaning. And I think it's important to try as much as possible to examine each layer as separately as possible, but obviously there will be some bleeding in with each other, in an attempt to know what our ancestors were doing and why. Now, we know that the word February comes from the Latin word for purification, so I suspect that is what our forebears were doing at this time of year. They were using ashes in a kind of ritualistic way to purify. Now, February is also known as the fallow month, as nothing much grows and the winter harvest is all but exhausted. It's a bit of an in-between time. So obviously our ancestors would have followed nature accordingly, as they lived much more in tune with nature because they weren't as technologically they didn't have the technology that we did, which I believe is a good thing and a bad thing. It's great and convenient in some ways, but also our over-dependence on it does mean that we are a lot more separated from nature than they were. So I think they would have been following nature and using this time as a purification time. Now, this also makes sense astrologically, as Pisces can be regarded as acting as a sort of filter. Not everything that was seeded last Yule or that is set to grow in the coming spring will survive into the new growing season, and that goes for anything. It may seem harsh, but it's also nature doing its work. Not everything that's seeded or created is going to make it. Now, subsequently, I also suspect that this time of year was used as a preparation of the quickening impulse that comes after or just on the spring equinox with the advent of the astrological time of Aries. Now, it's worth noting that wood ash quickens the soil, as I just said, and it feeds it with many essential minerals such as phosphorus and potassium. Now, I've long suspected that the solar aspect of astrology, and I say solar deliberately as I think there are many layers to astrology, I think it provides us with a map of the growing cycle of the year, much as the festivals do. I think they're very much interlinked, to be honest. So I think they provide us with a map. This is just on one very basic level, a map of the growing cycle of the year, which was followed not just for agricultural purposes but for ourselves too. I think this is what I have come to believe, that this kind of solar astrology process begins at Yule time, at the winter equinox, where a kind of seeding happens. That energy is quickened at the spring equinox and harvested in the autumn, and I think this explains part of the customs surrounding Ash Wednesday and Lent too. Our ancestors were undergoing a purification and filtering process, a spring cleaning really, in preparation for the quickening impulse of spring. This is because they knew that as nature affected the plants and animals, it affected them also. They did not see themselves as separate from nature but a part of it, and they knew how to harness these different currents of the seasons and use them creatively within their own lives. Now, if this is something that you think you'd like to do at this time of year, then things like fasting, detoxing and spring cleaning, and I don't just mean going through your cupboards, but also things like your social media accounts, your mobile, just anything that cleans and freshens up your life. These things are very beneficial at this time of year. Anything which sweeps out the old detritus and makes way for the new growth of spring in a few short weeks is very, very beneficial. Anyway, that's all I've got to say today. Thanks for listening, and I'll speak to you again soon. Bye.